Okay. I think this is recording. I'm not too sure. No joke. This is actually the like 50th million time that I'm after doing this. So if this is the video that goes up and you are watching this, it means that it's been successful. So let us pray, or let me pray. Um, I am recording this video on behalf of ICON. So ICON stands for Inner City Organisations Network. We are a community organisation based in the inner city there in Dublin 1. My role with ICON is community participation worker. So I would do a lot of work with people in emergency accommodation and kind of families and individuals in emergency accommodation, and also people in private rented. That's part of our work amongst other things. So we, before COVID, had done a number of workshops on various topics in housing provision, kind of approved housing bodies and how that was different to local authority, what kind of like financial help is out there for tenants and stuff like that. And they proved quite successful and they were well attended. Unfortunately, because of COVID, obviously we can't really proceed with any person-to-person workshops at the moment. So we decided that we would take some stuff online. And the most pressing issue is the emergency measures at the moment for renters and the protections that are in place. I'm going to just jump right into it because I'm just conscious that I've spent a long time trying to get to this point, so I'm just going to go for it. So yeah, the COVID Act is the emergency measures that were introduced in the public interest in March the 27th. And they essentially came into effect the day that lockdown happened. They were meant to be for a period of 3 months, but they got extended then until the 20th of July. So the emergency measures cover a number of different topics and issues. Specifically for this presentation, this workshop, we are going to just look at the emergency measures in place to cover tenants during the emergency period. As this presentation goes on, I'm going to keep referring to the emergency period, and essentially what I am referring to is the period between March 27th and July 20th. Now, at the moment, it is unclear if the government will extend the emergency period or tenancy protections after the 20th of July. We aren't sure yet. And I appreciate that we are a number of months into the emergency legislation. But the reason why we're kind of doing this video now is because we've had a lot of people come to us and ask what will happen after the emergency measures? What will happen when those tenancy protections are gone? What will happen to my tenancy, essentially? So what we're going to look at in this presentation is a brief summary of the tenancy protections, but we will also then move to what might happen after the 20th of July. So for example, what might happen if you got a termination notice? What might happen after the 20th of July if you got a rent increase? And what might happen if you get an eviction notice or the landlord is trying to evict you, landlord or letting agent. So we'll kind of cover the kind of probabilities, let's just say. For legal heads, or for anybody wanting to, I guess, read more in depth about these emergency measures, this is the legislation. This is what it looks like. That's the front page. And then specifically part 2 is what governs the tenancy protections section. So in your own time, if you guys want to read that, by all means, you'll be well versed then. So yeah, the emergency measures in the public interest for tenants kind of has 3 main protections, like the 3 big protections. So that is that you cannot have your rent increased during the emergency period. So from March 27th until July 20th, your rent cannot be increased. You cannot be served a notice of termination by your landlord. So from March 27th to July 20th, termination notices that are served will be invalid. Landlords and letting agents cannot serve them at the moment. You cannot be evicted from your home. So evictions at present are prohibited. And these rules actually apply to all types of rentals, including owner occupied, which is where you're sharing your accommodation with your landlord. It also includes student accommodation and digs type accommodation where meals are provided. As I was saying, rents are frozen for the duration of the emergency period. You can't have your rent increase during this time, and it applies to all types of tenancies. We will be discussing kind of a little bit more in detail, like what happens if you got a rent notice before COVID and it was due to happen during the emergency period. So we will be explaining that later on in the slides. With the notice of termination, they cannot be served. So, for example, if a landlord today or a letting agent today gives me a termination notice, it is invalid, it's void, it won't stand. No notices of termination can be issued at the moment. They can only be issued after the 20th of July. So if your landlord serves you with a notice of termination before the 20th of July, and you were due basically to move out during the emergency period, you essentially don't have to move out. And any time that is yet to be served on your notice will be added on after the 20th of July. Now, I know that's probably hard to comprehend or get your head around. It did take me a little while to understand it. So I kind of done up a bit of I don't even know what you'd call this, a bit of a graft or like some kind of visual thing. I'm definitely a visual person. So this looks really complicated, but it's actually not. So I'll talk you through it. So a 28-day notice was given on Friday, the 13th of March. Okay. And that's represented by the little blue circle there. So if COVID, the emergency measures, if they hadn't have happened, the termination of that tenancy would be due to happen on the 10th of April, 28 days later. But on the 27th of March, the emergency measures were put in place to protect tenants, which meant that no evictions could happen. So you can see here, the red lines have crossed out all the dates where evictions cannot take place. So that means that on the 10th of April, you won't be moving out of your home or whatever day notice that you have been given. So then on the 20th of July, you have what you're going to do then, if you see here with the blue circle, from the 13th till the 27th, that's 14 days. So there has been 14 days served on that initial notice, and there is 14 days left to serve on the notice. So what you would do is on the 20th of July, you add 14 days to your initial notice, and it will give you then your new date of termination. So in this circumstance, a landlord cannot evict these tenants until Monday, the 3rd of August, because you're adding the 14 days on. So the new date of termination is going to be August the 3rd. I'll just give you guys a second to have a look at that. The legend is kind of just here over the side explaining. And that would be the same if it's a 90-day notice or whatever day notice you get. You basically just add on the unserved part of the termination notice. With evictions, as I was saying, they are prohibited, and this includes from local authority housing and also traveller accommodation. Evictions they shouldn't be happening. Now, from seeing things on Facebook and from talking to other people who are involved in housing, there has been cases coming up where evictions actually have happened, and we will discuss what to do if that happens to you. If you're overholding, which is essentially where you have stayed past your notice, you can now remain in the dwelling until the end of the emergency period. But you have to follow the terms of your tenancy agreement. And part of those terms is to pay your rent. So I know that sounds maybe like a bit of a catch-22, like in order to kind of not be evicted, you have to pay rent. but COVID has happened and a lot of people are out of work. So that might mean that a lot of people cannot pay rent. So with regards to rent arrears, if you've fallen into rent arrears during the emergency period, your landlord has to give a 28-day warning notice for you to pay. Before COVID, it used to be a 14-day notice period. Okay. So if you have lost your job and maybe you're awaiting your COVID payment, which is 350, but a lot of people are saying the 350 doesn't even cover their basic rent. And bear in mind, like, a lot of people's rent are upwards of a third, if not more, of their income, which is crazy, like, you know. So there is going to be thousands of people out there that are going to go into rent arrears because they simply can't afford it. Your landlord has to give you a warning notice now of 28 days. If you haven't paid your rent after those 28 days, but we are still within the emergency period, you cannot be evicted. So technically you cannot be evicted until after the 20th of July. And I'll discuss this in the next slide a little bit better. As I was saying, it is your obligation as a tenant, and it's set out in the Tenancy Act, the Residential Tenancies Act, that as part of tenant obligations, we are all obliged to pay our rent in full, even during the emergency period. So if a landlord is going to terminate after the emergency period because you're in rent arrears, there is a certain process that has to be followed. So as I was saying, the written notification or the warning notice that you have gone into arrears is 28 days. That has to come first. So the notification of rent arrears is totally different from the eviction notice. And the warning notice has to come, I don't know what I'm doing with my hands here, but the warning notice has to come first, and it has to come. So if a landlord hasn't served you a warning notice, kind of just take a deep breath, because it would mean that the eviction notice can't come first. Basically, the warning notice has to come first. So during COVID, up until the 20th of July, as it stands, the warning notice is 28 days. After the 28-day period, which again has to come after the 20th of July. So the landlord can serve a notice on the 20th of July to say that you are in rent arrears, you basically haven't abided by the written notification to pay back that rent. Basically, they can serve a notice of termination then. And the minimum days that you have to be given is 28 days. So in total, depending on when you get your written notification of arrears, you could potentially have upwards of 50, I'm not great at maths, but 50 something days before you may have to move out of your property. How long of notice of termination you get for rent arrears will actually depend on whether or not you have a Part 4 tenancy. Now, without getting into the exactly what that is, like, I think to sum it up, a Part 4 tenancy is when your kind of tenancy rights kick in under the Residential Tenancies Act. So if you are in the property for less than 6 months, you will only get a 28-day notice period. If you're in the property for 6 months or more but less than a year, you're entitled to 90 days. If you're in the property for a year or more but less than 3 years, you're entitled to 120 days. 3 years but less than 7 is 180 days. 7 years but less than 8 is 196 days. And 8 years or more is going to count as 224. Now, just a word of note, like the way evictions and termination notices and stuff like that have all been on hold for the emergency period, so too are the Part 4 tenancy rights. So without complicating it too much, if you've been in the property for 6 months, and then, or less than 6 months, let's just say, and then COVID emergency measures has happened, you also pause your time in your tenancy during those 3 months. So if I'm in a property for 3 months and COVID starts, well, basically my tenancy rights won't actually kick in until I serve another 3 months. So the time will restart on the 20th of July, and it would mean then 20th of July, 20th of August, 20th of September. It means then that I won't get my Part 4 tenancy rights until basically like October, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please email me at the end of this, or you can give me a call, and I will try and explain that a little bit better. There are going to be so many people out there that can't afford to pay their rent, and it's just the way it is. There will be some landlords and letting agents that will understand this and will try and work with the tenants. Like that, you will have minority landlords who just might not really give that leeway. Some general advice that we will give is that if you can't afford to pay your rent at the moment, you really should contact the landlord or letting agent, because they may agree a reduced rate until your situation improves. So try and negotiate. Like, don't stop paying your rent completely, because it is your obligation to pay rent, and you will leave yourself in a really vulnerable position if you just stop completely. Again, ring or speak to the landlord about paying a reduced rate. But before paying the reduced rate, you really, really need to speak to the landlord or letting agent. It's a really good idea as well to get any agreements in writing, whether this is paper format, email, or text message. Sometimes from like a legal perspective, maybe landlords might shy away from the kind of in writing stuff. But to cover yourself, what I would advise is, if you speak to a landlord or letting agent on the phone, and you make a verbal agreement on the phone, what I would do is I would either follow up by email or by text message. Something very simple like, oh, hey, thanks for taking the call. We said this, this, and this on the phone, and we agreed to this, this, and this. You make sure that you just have that in writing for yourself, because you don't know when you'll need to reference it again, or if you will need to reference, but it would be handy to have. For those who are really struggling to pay rent and the COVID emergency payment isn't covering like majority of that payment, you can apply for short-term rent supports. So we have here the form, the first page of the rent supplement application. So rent supplement is a short-term payment, and it is available on a short-term basis for people struggling financially. Unfortunately, it's not going to be available for full-time students. It won't be available for tenants living in local authorities. It won't be available for people renting with parents, nor will it be available for owner-occupied sharing with landlords setups, which is kind of like limiting then as well, because people in these circumstances could be struggling as well, and so that kind of is unfortunate, but that's what's laid out. The new rules for the rent supplement will be in place until August 2020, so like the end of August 31st. And previously, rent supplement, you could kind of only really work 30 hours, whereas now they're saying you can work above 30 hours as long as your income has been reduced. That would determine you like that you would be struggling to pay rent, that you can apply. Previously as well, rent supplement would be means tested, so it would be maybe a few, it could maybe be 2 or 3 weeks of a process before you actually get a payment to help you pay your rent, whereas now, excuse me, if you've been diagnosed with COVID, or you have to, you've been like advised medically to quarantine for the 2 weeks, and if you're without pay, the rent supplement payment can actually be processed straight away. So it is a real help to people that are in need of that short-term support. However, after the 31st of August, the initial rules and guidelines around the rent supplement will come back into play, and your case will be reviewed in line with these original guidelines, and you might essentially have to be means tested. It might be a conclusion that the social welfare will deem that you actually need a longer term housing support and rent supplement is not suitable to you because it's short term. So it might be suggested then at that point in time that you apply for the housing assistance payment. So the housing assistance payment is a longer term rent support. It's a form of social housing support. In order to actually apply for housing assistance, you have to fill out a social housing application. So you would have to go on the social housing list per se. So as I was saying, HAP is long-term social housing support, and you must be eligible for social housing. Once you qualify for social housing, you will then be able to get HAP. And if you look here, this is the first page of the social housing application. If you determine that you will need a longer term support today, I wouldn't hesitate in actually getting that housing application underway, because there can actually be a delay while it kind of reviews your application and assesses whether you're eligible or not. Like it could take up to a few weeks, and there probably will be an influx of applications like coming in now at the moment. So with regards to social housing, like it is a proper assessment, and you will have to satisfy various things. And one of those criteria is an income criteria. So that your rate of pay or your income is not above the thresholds that they've set, and we'll look at that on the next slide. You must also show that you do not have suitable alternative accommodation. And when I say suitable alternative accommodation, I mean that you don't own a load of property somewhere else, that you have a genuine housing need. I'm very conscious as well that between rent supplement and HAP, that these are both payments that I can talk a lot about, but for this particular workshop, I'm only just briefly touching upon them because I would like to give people the information straight out. And we will be doing another workshop that will come in the next few days that will really look at, like, kind of, it'll go through the whole application and it will talk about the differences. As well, HAP is, without giving too much information, has two strands. So it has mainstream HAP and homeless HAP. But like that, I will give that information in another online video. This is specifically if there is an immediate need, an emergency, like right now, so that you guys know what you would have to fill out. When it comes to HAP and applying for social housing, as I was saying, there is an income criteria. So who can apply? Band 1, which is the only band I'm covering in this presentation, Band 1 covers Dublin and a number of other areas, and different counties will have different bands. So Band 1 goes from 35,000 here for a single person household, and it goes all the way up to 42,000, depending on your circumstances, whether you're a single person, a couple with no children, or a couple or a single person with 1, 2, 3, 4 children. That will depend on what kind of criteria you fit into with regards to income. So that gives you a good indication as to who can apply. I'm particularly with a lot of people who have maybe lost their jobs or are on reduced hours. If you are entitled to apply for social housing, I would recommend that you do. If you have a need, you should apply. When it comes to rates or what kind of financial help you can get if you're renting in private rented, again, it differs versus different councils. So for Dublin City Council, here are the rates that you guys can avail of. So for one adult in shared accommodation, it's €430. And depending on your circumstances, couple in shared accommodation, one adult all the way up to 3 children, it jumps from 430 and ranges up to 1,300. These are the kind of set rates, but with mainstream HAP, if your rent is kind of over these thresholds, they can apply a discretion of 20%. And with homeless HAP, they can apply a discretion of up to 50%. So that's kind of like, that would be it in a nutshell when it comes to the social housing band. Whether or not you are entitled will depend on your income at the moment. And also then these are the rates that you can get when you're living in private rented. Like that, the next workshop on these payments will go into greater detail about kind of how to apply and the forms, looking at the forms in detail, but also talking about the challenges and the difficulties such as discrimination faced by people trying to access properties on HAP, etc. So as I was saying, we're going to kind of touch on what to do if. So I'm taking the three main protections. I'm taking the three main protections that have come in earlier slides around that you can't get a rent increase, you can't get a termination notice, and you can't be evicted. So essentially in this slide, we're looking at what if you do? What if you do get a notification of a rent increase? What to do? The first thing I would advise in this instance is to not pay the increase. Write to your landlord or letting agent, reminding them of the emergency measures in the Public Interest COVID-19 Act, that it is against these measures to increase the rent during the emergency period. Should your landlord or letting agent pursue an increase, I just noticed a typo there, so apologies for that. It's meant to be an increase. You can refer a dispute to the Residential Tenancies Board, in short, the RTB. And I will be discussing that in a few slides forward, so don't be panicking. What if you get a termination notice? So under the emergency measures in the Public Interest COVID-19 Act, termination notices served during this time are invalid. Continue in your tenancy. Now, because the termination notice is invalid, what I would suggest, and maybe some people would rather notify the landlord or the letting agent that the notice is invalid, or some people would just prefer to not notify. Technically, because the notice is invalid, if the landlord or letting agent goes to evict, it's like that termination notice just doesn't exist. It's null void. It's cancelled, you know? So say down the line when they try to evict, you can just be like, well, actually that notice, that termination notice was actually illegitimate, and it won't stand, and they will have to reissue a valid termination notice. So you don't necessarily need to notify your landlord or letting agent that their notice is invalid. I would leave the responsibility to the landlord and letting agent to educate themselves on that matter, and hopefully it will buy you guys a little bit more time. However, should your landlord or letting agent pursue an illegitimate termination notice, for example, like what we said with the calendar, and when they got the 28-day notice in March, if they went to pursue that termination notice and evict a tenant during the emergency period, you should refer a dispute to the Residential Tenancies Board. Or vice versa, if they're pursuing an illegitimate termination notice that was served during the emergency period, again, refer the dispute to the Residential Tenancy Board. What to do if you're getting evicted? So under the emergency measures, evictions are prohibited and illegal, as we've said. An illegal eviction is where a landlord might force, intimidate, or otherwise denies a tenant from accessing a rented dwelling or remove the tenant's belongings from the dwelling. So for example, if a landlord comes and says that you need to get out, that they're changing the locks, maybe they've turned off the electricity to try and flush tenants out, they're all examples of illegal attempts at evicting tenants. And the RTB takes that very seriously. If you are facing an eviction at the moment, or you know somebody facing an eviction, give them the advice that they need to refer that dispute to the Residential Tenancies Board immediately. Also, just back on the rent increase, if you get a rent increase before COVID measures happen, so before the 27th of March, and it says basically that you're due a rent increase and it's to come into effect during the emergency measures, the landlord, when you notify the landlord that you can't actually up the rent until after the 20th of July, if they come back to you and say, okay, well, we'll up the rent on the 20th of July, just double check that, one, you haven't got a rent increase within the last year, because you're only allowed to have one rent increase per year. And then secondly, that the rent increase is within the 4%. All of Dublin is a rent pressure zone, and there is time periods governing rent increases, and also the increase has to be within the legitimate 4%. So for example, if the landlord says, oh, okay, I didn't know about the emergency measures, that's okay, I'll put the rent increase off until the 20th of July. Just double check that, one, it's 12 months since you had a rent increase, and two, that it's within the 4%. Again, we are going to do another video on know your rights in private rented, and it will cover all of the rights in general, not just relating to COVID, but it's going to cover landlord obligations and duties, and also your obligations as tenants, and that will come. So but as we said, if you're facing an eviction, I know it can be very stressful and very scary, and tenants might not know what to do. But I will reiterate that the RTB does take evictions seriously, and they can actually issue a kind of the equivalent of a barring order and stuff like that, that will stop the landlord or letting agent attempting an illegal eviction. So with the Residential Tenancies Board, essentially it's a body that's established to resolve disputes between landlords and tenants. So these disputes they might give advice as to how you can resolve the dispute between yourself, landlord, or letting agent kind of on your own through self-resolution methods. Or if that doesn't work, for example, if the landlord is demanding that you pay a rent increase after you're writing to them and letting them know of the emergency measures, what you could do then is either choose a mediation form of dispute resolution, or you can choose an adjudication. So mediation is kind of informal. The RTB will help with this, and it's also free of charge. So usually it's kind of just like a general chit chat, and trying to resolve it without it leading to an adjudication or something more formal. So an adjudication then is basically an investigation. You have to submit evidence. If it's the landlord submitting a dispute or the tenant submitting a dispute, both of those parties will submit evidence, and then the adjudicator is appointed to hear both sides, and they will then decide how the dispute should be resolved. So that is a kind of a formal process. If the adjudication, say for example, if the RTB then says to the landlord, well, no, actually you can't increase the rent, and the adjudicator rules that, but the landlord continues to pursue the tenant, or decides that he or she wants to appeal the adjudicator's conclusion, what would happen then is it can go to an appeal or a tribunal. And then basically anything that's ruled at that tribunal then is binding. Like, it's a determination order. It's legally binding on both of those parties that are involved. AKA, it could be like, no, you can't increase that rent, and that tenant cannot be penalized for not paying an increase of rent. That's just one example. Or you might seek adjudication for an illegitimate or kind of a termination notice that was served during the emergency period that's not going to stand. You might send that to an adjudication, and they might rule in your favor to say, well, yes, that's that notice is invalid and you need to go and serve a valid notice. Again, we'll be talking about notices and what determines a valid notice and an invalid notice in greater detail in the Know Your Rights video that will follow. So don't worry too much about that. I think what you just need to know in this time round is that if you are facing a rent increase during COVID, a termination notice during COVID, or an eviction, that the Residential Tenancies Board is open to adjudication. Now, it will be a little bit different because of emergency measures. For example, they aren't accepting applications by paper format. You have to submit applications online. Online applications cost €15. They're actually cheaper than the paper format. I think the paper format costs about €25 maybe. So the online, you can pay by either debit card, credit card, checks, postal orders, or bank drafts. So there is a number of ways to pay. And how you go about applying for dispute resolution, go to this website. So it's www.rtb.ie. And then you will go to the login register section, and that will be up the right hand corner. It's like a little kind of green rectangle box. Click that. You will need to create an account, and then you can use that account to create a dispute application online. Now, there are other resources available to tenants. Like, they can give advice for tenants during COVID, and kind of just greater tenancy advice in general. And those services, these are their logos. So obviously ourselves, we're Icon. I've given a brief introduction to ourselves earlier on. We are a community organisation. We're based in the inner city, and we work on community development principles. So we are all about trying to teach the community kind of rights-based stuff, so that communities and tenants themselves can resolve issues from a very informed position. So that's us in a nutshell. We do a number of other things as well, like events and tenants groups, and we work a little bit sometimes with the drugs task force and stuff like that. So our role is very varied, and it's a lot of flavour. It's very interesting, and we get to meet a lot of great people, and I feel very privileged to hold the position that I do here. So shout out to Icon. Also, Threshold. I'm just conscious my laptop just said it was going to die. I think it's not plugged in properly, so give me 2 seconds. Ta-da. There are pros and cons to these online things, and I think this technical difficulties is definitely one. Ooh. Okay, that's us. Yeah, so shout out to Threshold then. Threshold are a housing charity, and they provide advice and support to people with housing issues. So they have their website as well is full of resources for tenants, and they have a phone service, and I think potentially may run drop-in spaces as well. So they are a great resource. CATU then is quite a new organisation. It's a community and tenants union. So basically the idea of having a union outside of the workplace, and they are for communities and tenants. So in your workplace, you might have Forza or SIP2 or anything like that that you join, depending on what area of employment you're in. Whereas CAT2 had an idea of bringing communities and tenants together and having a union that would basically have like communities and tenants together fighting the key issues that relate to their areas or their tenancies and stuff. So again, I'd recommend that you look them up on Facebook and Twitter, and they're doing really, really good work, and they have a number of local branches set up around Dublin. And they're just going to grow from here. Anyway, citizens information is also a great resource for people. It's a statutory body, and it supports the provision of information, advice and advocacy on a broad range of public and social services. Citizens information is great as well if you want to look up information around the payments, like rent supplement, HAP. They have a great way of giving you information that is quite accessible, and it's easy to read, and it is very informative. And I would like to thank Citizens Information because a lot of their information forms the basis for a lot of the workshops that we do. And then also we have another great organization is Mercy Law. They're an independent law centre and registered charity. They provide free legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless in the areas of social housing and related social housing law. So Mercy Law doesn't really cover the private rented side of things, but if you're in emergency accommodation or you're in social housing like local authority and stuff like that, they may be able to provide you with free legal advice. So I would definitely recommend giving those other 4 organisations a look, and their websites are full of information and full of flavour, and they are a great resource for tenants and people who are living in other housing provisions as well. So that kind of concludes the end of the workshop. We are Icon. We're based there on Lower Buckingham Street, Dublin 1. Our website then is www.iconnetwork.ie. So you can check out our website. It's still in its infancy. We've updated it and it's looking fresh. But we will add these videos up as we go along. So hopefully there will be a number of resources there as well for people to access. If you've had any questions or you'd like to leave any comments or anything like that with regards to the workshop, you can email me. My email is ashling@iconnetwork.ie. I would just like to say as well that we endeavour to give the most up-to-date, correct information, and if anybody has noticed anything that needs updating or anything like that, do let us know. Our contact number actually for the office is 01 836 6890. And then for my own contact number for the community participation is 083 433 8382. And on that note, I am going to conclude this video and pray that I can upload it. As I said, do pop us an email or get in contact if you have any questions. If you're a tenant and you're having issues that are arising in your tenancy, feel free to contact us. We can elaborate on the information that's here or point you in the right direction for further support, or potentially we can actually offer that support as well. So don't hesitate to get in contact with us. So yeah, on that note, I hope you have a lovely day, and thank you so much for tuning in to our workshop. And there will be many more to come. As I said, we're going to cover payments, like rental, help, financial help payments in greater detail. We'll also be covering just tenancy rights in general in greater detail. So yeah, do stay tuned. And if there is anything, any subjects around housing provision that you would like covered, or that you think would be beneficial for us to do, by all means, like, share suggestions as well. We're happy to cover, we're happy to cover whatever the demand is, let's just say. But yeah, so I'm gonna end this now. Thank you so much, and talk to you soon. Bye.